I stood in Gerald Patterson's office at 8:15 on a Thursday morning, my hands steady despite my racing heart. The COO sat behind his mahogany desk with that smug expression I'd come to know too well over the past 6 months. He'd just accused me of moonlighting for a competing firm. His evidence nothing more than after-hours activity logged on my company laptop. I didn't deny it. What Gerald didn't know was that the firm I'd been consulting for wasn't a competitor. It was the State Pharmaceutical Regulatory Board. And at 7:30 that morning, exactly 45 minutes ago, 3 inspectors had arrived in the lobby downstairs with 2 federal agents for the unannounced audit I'd helped coordinate. The same inspection he'd been tipped off about weeks ago but arrogantly chose to ignore. My name is Aubrey, and 6 months before that confrontation in Gerald's office, I actually loved my job. I was a senior compliance officer at MedSource Distribution, a mid-sized pharmaceutical distribution company in Colorado that supplied prescription medications to hospitals and pharmacies across 3 states. I'd been with the company for 4 years, working my way up from an entry-level inventory specialist position right after I graduated with my degree in pharmaceutical sciences. My daily work involved ensuring proper storage temperatures for medications, maintaining chain of custody documentation, verifying pharmacy licenses, and conducting internal audits. It sounds tedious when I describe it that way, but I found it meaningful. Every properly stored vial of insulin, every correctly documented shipment of chemotherapy drugs, every verified pharmacy license meant real people would get the medications they needed to survive and thrive. I took that responsibility seriously. The company had always felt like a good place to work. Our CEO, Richard Pemberton, had built MedSource from the ground up over 20 years. He knew the pharmaceutical industry inside and out, and he genuinely cared about doing things right. My direct supervisor, Diana Huang, was the VP of Operations. She'd been in the industry for 2 decades and taught me almost everything I knew about pharmaceutical compliance. Diana was tough but fair, expecting excellence but also protecting her team when we needed support. Everything changed 8 months before my firing when Richard hired Gerald Patterson as our new Chief Operating Officer. Gerald came from a corporate consulting background with an impressive resume full of Fortune 500 companies. What he didn't have was any actual experience in pharmaceuticals. Richard saw that as an asset, saying Gerald would bring fresh perspective and efficiency improvements. I saw it as a red flag from day one. Gerald was in his early 50s, always impeccably dressed in expensive suits, always talking about maximizing shareholder value and operational optimization. He spoke in corporate buzzwords that sounded impressive but meant nothing. Within his first month, he'd already alienated half the warehouse staff by implementing new productivity metrics that ignored the careful handling requirements for sensitive medications. I worked closely with Trevor Banks, our warehouse manager. Trevor was in his early 30s and had been with MedSource for 6 years. He knew every inch of our facilities, understood the equipment, and genuinely cared about his team. I could see the stress building in him as Gerald pushed for faster processing times without understanding why certain procedures couldn't be rushed. My closest friend at work was Melissa Grant, a fellow compliance officer around my age. We'd started at MedSource within months of each other and had supported each other through professional certifications, difficult audits, and the occasional office drama. Melissa had a sharp eye for detail and a dry sense of humor that got me through long days of documentation review. The incident that changed everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon, 6 months before my firing. I was conducting a routine quarterly audit of our cold storage facilities. These units maintain medications that required refrigeration, things like insulin, certain antibiotics, and biologics. The temperature had to stay between 36 and 46 degrees Fahrenheit at all times. Even a few hours outside that range could compromise the medication's effectiveness or make it dangerous. Our primary monitoring system showed perfect temperature logs, consistent readings right in the middle of the safe range for the past 3 months. But we also kept backup thermometers in each unit as a failsafe, and I always checked them during audits. When I opened the main cold storage unit and looked at the backup thermometer, my stomach dropped. It read 51 degrees, 5 degrees might not sound like much, but in pharmaceutical storage, it's the difference between medication that works and medication that could fail when a patient needs it most. I immediately checked the primary monitoring system again, still showing 43 degrees. I documented everything with photographs and timestamps, then went straight to Diana's office. Diana took one look at my face and closed her door. I showed her the evidence. The color drained from her face. She asked me if I'd told anyone else, and I said no, I'd come to her first. She nodded and told me she'd handle it personally. She promised to call our equipment maintenance contractor immediately and report the discrepancy to our pharmaceutical suppliers as required by our contracts and regulations. I left her office feeling worried, but trusting that Diana would do the right thing. She always had before. 2 days later, Diana called me into her office. She looked like she hadn't slept. She told me she'd reported the issue to Gerald as required by our chain of command. His response had shocked her. Gerald dismissed the concern entirely, saying the backup thermometer must be faulty. He'd ordered a replacement thermometer but explicitly instructed Diana not to report the potential temperature excursion to our suppliers or halt any distributions from that unit. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Industry regulations were crystal clear. Any suspected temperature excursion had to be reported immediately. Affected medications had to be quarantined pending investigation. Suppliers had to be notified so they could determine if the products were still safe for use. What Gerald was ordering wasn't just bad practice. It was a direct violation of federal pharmaceutical distribution regulations. I suggested we document everything and perhaps consult with our legal department. Diana agreed, but asked me to be patient while she worked on convincing Gerald. She seemed genuinely shaken, caught between doing what she knew was right and following orders from her new boss. I trusted her, so I agreed to wait. 1 week later, I followed up with Diana. She told me the new equipment had arrived and been installed. Everything was fine now. Something in her tone bothered me, so after she left for the day, I went down to the warehouse to check for myself. The primary monitoring system had been recalibrated and was working properly. But when I asked Trevor about the maintenance, he looked confused. He pulled up the work order on his computer. Gerald had ordered a new backup thermometer to replace the old one. That was it. The actual cold storage unit's refrigeration system and primary monitoring equipment had never been inspected or recalibrated at all. I stood there in the warehouse, staring at that work order, and felt something shift inside me. Gerald hadn't fixed the problem. He just replaced the thermometer that revealed the problem. The underlying issue, whatever was causing the temperature discrepancy, remained unaddressed. I went to Diana's office first thing the next morning. I didn't schedule a meeting. I just walked in and closed the door. I told her what I'd discovered. For a long moment, she just looked at me. Then she did something I'd never seen her do before. She started to cry. Diana admitted that Gerald had threatened her job if she pushed back on his decision. He'd told her the company couldn't afford the revenue loss from halting distribution or the regulatory scrutiny that would come from reporting the issue. He'd said she needed to decide if she was a team player or a liability. She'd chosen to keep her job and her mortgage payments and her daughter's college tuition. She asked me, almost begging, to please just drop it. I left her office feeling betrayed and alone. The supervisor I'd trusted and admired had folded under pressure. The institutional systems I'd believed would protect patient safety had failed. And I was faced with an impossible choice: keep my head down and my paycheck, or do something that would almost certainly cost me everything. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about those medications sitting in improperly stored conditions, being shipped out to pharmacies and hospitals, being given to patients who trusted they were receiving safe, effective treatment. I thought about someone's grandmother taking insulin that might not work properly because of storage problems we knew about but covered up. I thought about a cancer patient receiving chemotherapy drugs that had been compromised. By morning, I knew I couldn't drop it, but I also knew I had to be smart about what came next. I couldn't let it go, but I also couldn't charge forward recklessly. I needed to document everything and understand the full scope of the problem before deciding my next move. So I started paying closer attention to things I'd previously taken at face value. Over the next month, I noticed other irregularities that sent chills down my spine. During a routine verification of our pharmacy customer list, I cross-referenced our shipment records against the state licensing database. 3 pharmacies that had received substantial orders of controlled substances in the past quarter didn't appear in the database at all. I checked twice, thinking maybe I'd entered the license numbers incorrectly. But no, these pharmacies either had no valid licenses or their licenses had expired months ago. That was a massive red flag. Distributing controlled substances to unlicensed pharmacies wasn't just a regulatory violation, it was potentially criminal. It could mean we were unknowingly part of illegal drug distribution networks. I started reviewing chain of custody forms more carefully. These documents tracked every hand that touched high-value or controlled medications from our warehouse to final delivery. They required signatures from specific personnel at each transfer point. When I cross-referenced the signatures with HR records showing employee schedules, I found multiple instances where warehouse staff had supposedly signed forms on days they were out sick or on vacation. Someone was forging signatures, and not just occasionally, systematically. The deeper I dug, the more wrong I found. And I noticed something else troubling. Gerald had started attending Trevor's weekly warehouse team meetings. He'd never shown interest in warehouse operations before. Now he was there every Tuesday morning. And according to Trevor, he spent most of the meeting asking detailed questions about shipping procedures and documentation practices. I confided in Melissa during lunch one day. We sat in my car in the parking lot, and I laid out everything I'd discovered. She was quiet for a long time. Then she admitted she'd noticed similar issues, but had been too afraid to speak up. Gerald had already fired 2 employees since he arrived, both for vague performance issues that seemed like pretexts. The message was clear: don't make waves, or you're gone. But Melissa also told me something I hadn't known. One of the fired employees, a quality assurance specialist named Aaron, had apparently questioned some of Gerald's policy changes before he was terminated. Melissa had overheard part of the conversation. Aaron had been concerned about new efficiency metrics that shortened quality check times. 2 weeks later, he was fired for inadequate documentation. The official reason had nothing to do with his questions, but the timing was suspect. I realized Gerald was systematically removing anyone who might challenge him or notice what he was doing, which meant I had to be extremely careful, or I'd be next. I spent 3 days preparing a detailed memo documenting every compliance violation I'd uncovered: temperature discrepancies, unlicensed pharmacy shipments, forged chain of custody signatures, suspicious changes to standard operating procedures. I included dates, specific examples, photographs where I had them, and references to the exact regulations being violated. I scheduled a meeting with Diana and presented the memo. I watched her read it, her face growing paler with each page. When she finished, she looked up at me and said she'd take it to Gerald and Richard. She promised me they'd take this seriously. I wanted to believe her. 3 days later, I was called into a conference room. Gerald, Diana, and Richard were already seated. I expected a serious discussion about my findings. Instead, I walked into an ambush. Gerald accused me of overstepping my authority, misinterpreting data, and creating a hostile work environment with unfounded allegations. He had answers for everything. The temperature discrepancy was a faulty backup thermometer, long since replaced. The unlicensed pharmacies were affiliated locations of licensed chains, and the state database was often months behind on updates. The signature discrepancies were clerical errors that had already been addressed with retraining. He made me sound paranoid and incompetent. And the worst part was watching Richard believe him. Richard Pemberton, who I'd respected for years, looked at me with disappointment. He said that while he appreciated my attention to detail, I needed to trust that leadership had the bigger picture. He suggested I'd been under stress and offered me a week of paid leave to reset and recharge. I refused the leave. I looked Richard directly in the eye and asked about the specific pharmacies I'd identified. I gave him the names and addresses. I asked him to personally verify their licenses right now, in this meeting, using the state database. Gerald smoothly interjected that he'd already verified them through the chain's corporate office. He even pulled up an email on his phone showing license documentation from someone at the pharmacy chain's headquarters. It looked legitimate. I had no way to verify if it was real or fabricated. But Richard seemed satisfied. I felt the trap closing around me. Gerald was too prepared, too smooth. He'd anticipated every question and had plausible answers ready. I was being painted as a problem employee, not a concerned compliance officer trying to protect patient safety. The meeting ended with Richard telling me to take the rest of the day off, whether I wanted to or not. He said it in a kind voice, like he was doing me a favor. I gathered my things and left, knowing I'd just lost any chance of fixing this from inside the company. That evening, I sat in my apartment staring at my laptop, trying to figure out my next move. That's when I received an email to my personal address. The sender was a Gmail account I didn't recognize. Concerned colleague 7739@gmail.com. The email had no message, just an attachment, a photograph of a shipping manifest I'd never seen before. My hands shook as I opened it. The manifest showed MedSource distributing controlled substances, specifically oxycodone in various dosages, to 3 pharmacies. The quantities were staggering. One pharmacy in a tiny town called Riverside, population 800 according to the manifest notes, had received enough oxycodone in a single month to treat 20,000 patients. That was impossible for a legitimate operation. No pharmacy in a town of 800 people would need that much opioid pain medication unless something illegal was happening. The only explanation was that the pharmacy was a front, a pill mill distributing drugs illegally, and MedSource, my company, was supplying them. I stared at that photograph for an hour, my mind racing. Someone inside the company knew what was happening. Someone with access to shipping records. Someone who was too afraid to come forward openly but desperate enough to reach out anonymously. I thought about who it could be. Trevor had access to shipping manifests. So did several warehouse staff. Someone in accounting would have seen the payment records for these shipments. It could be anyone who'd seen something wrong and didn't know what to do about it. I saved the photograph to an encrypted folder on an external hard drive I kept for personal backups. Then I made a decision that would change everything. I couldn't fix this from inside MedSource. The people who were supposed to protect compliance and patient safety had either been intimidated into silence or were actively part of the problem. I needed to go outside the company. I needed to become a whistleblower. I spent 2 nights researching before I made my first call. I read everything I could find about whistleblower protections under federal law, pharmaceutical distribution regulations, reporting requirements for suspected violations, and the potential consequences of coming forward. The protections sounded good on paper. Federal law prohibits retaliation against employees who report violations in good faith. But I also read dozens of stories about whistleblowers who were fired anyway, who spent years in legal battles, who were blacklisted from their industries. The law might protect you eventually, but it couldn't prevent your employer from making your life miserable in the meantime. I created encrypted backups of all my documentation on 3 separate external drives. I kept one at home, one in a safety deposit box at my bank, and I mailed one to my younger brother Nathan, who was in graduate school in California. I didn't tell him what was on it, just asked him to keep it safe. Then I called the State Pharmaceutical Regulatory Board's compliance hotline. The automated system transferred me twice before I reached a human being. I explained I was a compliance officer with concerns about violations at a distribution company. The woman on the phone was professional but non-committal. She said someone from the investigation division would call me back within 3 business days. 2 days later, my phone rang. The caller identified herself as Patricia Rollins, a senior investigator with the board. She asked if I could meet in person to discuss my concerns. When I hesitated, she suggested a coffee shop 30 miles from my town, far enough that I wouldn't run into coworkers. I met Patricia on a Saturday morning. She was in her late 50s, dressed casually in jeans and a blazer, with kind eyes and a direct manner that immediately put me at ease. We sat in a corner booth, and I spread out printed copies of my documentation. Patricia listened without interrupting as I walked her through everything. The temperature discrepancies, the unlicensed pharmacies, the forged signatures, the anonymous manifest showing impossible quantities of controlled substances being shipped to tiny towns. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me if I understood what I was alleging. I told her I did. She asked if I was prepared for what comes next, if the board decided to investigate. She explained that companies always try to identify whistleblowers, even when investigations are supposed to be confidential. Even with legal protections, retaliation could be subtle, passed over for promotions, excluded from projects, given impossible performance targets, eventually pushed out through manufactured performance issues. My career in pharmaceutical distribution might effectively end, she said. Was I prepared for that? I asked her what would happen if I did nothing. She looked at me steadily and said that if medications were being improperly stored, people could be harmed. If controlled substances were being distributed to unlicensed entities, those drugs could end up being sold illegally, fueling addiction and destroying lives. Children could take compromised medication, elderly patients could suffer complications, cancer patients could receive ineffective chemotherapy. That's all I needed to hear. I told her I was prepared to cooperate fully. Patricia explained the process. The board would need to conduct a surprise inspection to prevent destruction of evidence. That meant I couldn't tell anyone at MedSource what I'd done, not even people I trusted. They'd need detailed information from me about the company's systems, security protocols, where records were kept, and who had access to what. I would essentially become a confidential informant. I'd continue working normally while meeting with Patricia after hours to provide information and answer questions. All communication would happen through encrypted email and burner phones. The inspection would occur within 2 to 3 months, once they'd built a complete case and coordinated with other regulatory agencies. Patricia warned me again about the risks. Once the inspection happened, there would be no hiding my involvement. Gerald would know someone inside gave the board information. If I'd left any digital footprints in my investigation, he'd figure out it was me. I told her I understood. We shook hands, and I became a whistleblower. The next 2 weeks were surreal. I went to work every day, attended meetings, completed audits, and smiled at colleagues, all while knowing I was secretly cooperating with state investigators. I met Patricia twice, always in different locations: a diner 40 miles away, a public library in a neighboring county. Each time I brought more information. I drew detailed floor plans of our warehouse and storage facilities. I explained our computer security system and who had administrative access. I identified which employees might be complicit versus simply following orders without understanding the bigger picture. I walked Patricia through our typical daily routines so investigators would know the best time to arrive for maximum impact. During our third meeting, Patricia told me something that made my blood run cold. The board had done preliminary research into the pharmacies I'd identified. All 3 were likely pill mills, fronts for illegal distribution of prescription opioids. If MedSource was knowingly supplying them, this wasn't just regulatory violations, it was federal drug trafficking. The investigation would involve the Drug Enforcement Administration. This had become much bigger than I'd initially understood. We weren't just talking about fines and license suspensions. People could go to prison. At work, I noticed Gerald watching me more closely. He started sitting in on my team meetings. He asked pointed questions about what I was working on. Once, he casually asked if I had any outside interests or side projects. I told him I'd been thinking about getting a dog. He didn't laugh. Diana pulled me aside one afternoon and told me Gerald had been asking HR about my performance, my background, whether I had any connections to competitors or regulatory agencies. She warned me to keep my head down. The concern in her voice seemed genuine, but I couldn't trust her anymore. She'd already chosen Gerald's side. I told Patricia about the increased scrutiny. She said they were almost ready but needed 2 more weeks to coordinate with the DEA and prepare the inspection team. Could I hold on that long? I said I'd try. One evening, I was working late updating compliance documentation. My computer started running slowly. When I checked the activity monitor to see what was consuming resources, I saw something that made my heart stop. Remote access software was running in the background. Someone in IT was watching my screen in real time. I carefully closed the compliance documents I'd been working on and opened harmless spreadsheets instead. I finished up random busy work for 20 minutes, then shut down my computer and left the building. In my car, I called Patricia from my personal phone. "This was bad," she said. "If they were monitoring my computer, they might already know I'd been accessing files outside my normal duties. We needed to accelerate the timeline." The next morning, I was called into an unexpected meeting with Gerald and someone from IT named Kyle. Gerald said there had been unusual activity on my laptop. Access to warehouse shipping records at odd hours. Large file downloads. Times when I should have been off duty but was logged into the system remotely. Kyle showed me the access logs. They were all real. Every instance was from when I'd been gathering evidence for Patricia. Gerald looked at me with those cold eyes and asked directly, "Aubrey, are you consulting for another company? We have evidence you've been working with an outside organization after hours. This is a direct violation of your employment contract's non-compete clause." He'd built a case for firing me based on the very work I was doing to expose him. If I denied it, I'd be lying. If I admitted it without context, I'd be confirming his version of events. If I was fired before the inspection, my credibility as a witness would be damaged. I made a split-second decision. I looked Gerald directly in the eye and said, "I'm not denying anything. Do what you need to do." The answer clearly wasn't what he expected. He'd been ready for me to panic, to confess to corporate espionage, to give him ammunition. Instead, my calm response threw him off balance. He exchanged a glance with Kyle, then dismissed me, saying he'd make a decision about my employment by end of week. I walked back to my desk on shaking legs and immediately texted Patricia a coded message we'd agreed on. She called me within 5 minutes. I told her what happened. She said they'd moved the inspection to Monday morning. That gave us 72 hours. Patricia told me the inspection was now scheduled for Monday morning at 7:30, 3 days away. The plan was for inspectors to arrive unannounced while I created a distraction by showing up early and ensuring key personnel were on site. She warned me that Gerald had likely been tipped off about the investigation by someone, possibly a corrupt official in a neighboring county they'd been monitoring. He might have already destroyed some evidence. Our advantage was that he didn't know exactly when the inspection would happen or how much evidence we had. He'd gotten complacent, confident he could manage the situation. My job was to act completely normal for the next 3 days while preparing for everything to explode on Monday morning. Friday was the longest day of my life. I went to work, processed paperwork, attended a quality assurance meeting, and had lunch with Melissa. She asked if I was okay because I seemed tense. I blamed it on stress from Gerald's scrutiny. She gave me a hug and told me to hang in there. That afternoon, an email appeared in my inbox from HR. Subject: Meeting scheduled. Monday morning, 8:15. Conference Room B. Attendees: Gerald Patterson, Sandra Walsh from HR, and me. The purpose was listed as employment status discussion. Gerald was going to fire me Monday morning at 8:15. He didn't know that 45 minutes earlier, state and federal investigators would be walking through the front doors. I forwarded the meeting invitation to Patricia. She replied with a single word: "Perfect." My job was to act completely normal for the next 3 days while preparing for everything to explode on Monday morning. Saturday, I tried to distract myself with errands and chores. I deep cleaned my apartment, went grocery shopping, called my parents in Arizona. They asked how work was going. I lied and said everything was fine. My mom mentioned that my brother Nathan had called them recently, asking if I was okay. He was worried because I'd seemed stressed during our last conversation. I called him Saturday evening. He answered on the first ring. I told him I loved him and appreciated him holding on to that package for me. He asked again if I was okay. I said I would be, soon, one way or another. He told me he'd get on a plane immediately if I needed him. I told him to stay focused on his dissertation but keep his phone on. He said he would. Sunday, I barely slept. I kept thinking about everything that could go wrong. What if Gerald had destroyed all the evidence? What if the inspectors didn't find anything conclusive? What if his tip-off was better than we thought, and he was fully prepared? What if I lost my job, my career, my reputation, and nothing changed? I thought about the patients who might have received compromised medication. I thought about communities being flooded with illegally distributed opioids. I thought about the letter I'd received during my research from a public health organization, describing how pill mills had devastated small towns across America, creating addiction crises that destroyed families. I thought about Diana's tears when she'd admitted to backing down. I thought about Melissa's fear of being fired. I thought about Trevor's stress as Gerald pushed him to cut corners. I thought about what kind of person I wanted to be, the kind who stayed silent to protect herself, or the kind who spoke up to protect others. By the time my alarm went off Monday morning at 5:30, I'd made peace with whatever came next. I showered, dressed in my most professional outfit, and drove to work. I arrived at 6:45, earlier than usual but not suspiciously so. I needed Gerald and Trevor both on site when the inspectors arrived. At 7, I sent Gerald an email. I have some questions about the meeting this morning. Would it be possible to speak with you before 8:15? I'd like to understand the concerns so I can address them properly. Professional, respectful, exactly the kind of message a worried employee would send. He responded at 7:20. Come to my office at 7:45. Perfect. He'd be on site. At 7:28, I was at my desk, pretending to review documents on my computer. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. At 7:30 exactly, I watched through the office windows as 3 people in business attire walked into our lobby carrying briefcases. Right behind them were 2 more individuals, a man and a woman, both with the unmistakable bearing of federal agents. Our receptionist, Jenny, looked confused. Then she picked up her phone. Through the glass, I could see her calling someone, probably Gerald. Within 30 seconds, Gerald came striding out of his office. He moved fast, his face already arranging itself into a professional smile. But I saw the moment he recognized what was happening. His steps faltered, just for a second, and his eyes scanned the office area. They landed on me. In that instant, he knew I'd brought them here. But here's what I didn't expect. Gerald didn't look panicked. As he approached the inspectors, his face showed confidence, almost triumph. He greeted them warmly, said he'd been expecting some kind of routine audit eventually, and offered full cooperation. My stomach dropped. He was prepared for this. Patricia had warned me he might have been tipped off, but seeing his confidence made me wonder if they were about to find nothing. If he'd hidden or destroyed everything. One of the inspectors, a tall woman with dark hair pulled back in a bun, introduced herself as Patricia Rollins. Watching her interact with Gerald in her official capacity was surreal after our secret meetings. She was all business, presenting credentials, explaining they were here to conduct an inspection of the facility's compliance with pharmaceutical distribution regulations. Gerald maintained his smooth corporate demeanor. He called Diana to join them and summoned Trevor from the warehouse. When Trevor appeared, looking nervous and sweaty, I saw Gerald's eyes flick toward him and narrow, just for a second. That tiny reaction told me something important. Gerald didn't fully trust Trevor, and maybe, just maybe, Trevor hadn't been as complicit as I'd feared. The inspection team spread out. 2 inspectors headed to the warehouse with Trevor. Patricia stayed with Gerald and Diana in the conference room, requesting documentation. The 2 federal agents, who identified themselves as DEA, began setting up in an empty office. I sat at my desk, supposedly working, actually watching everything unfold. Other employees started arriving for the workday, confused by the presence of investigators. Rumors spread quickly. People whispered. Some looked worried. Others seemed curious. At 8, Melissa arrived. She saw the inspectors and immediately looked at me. I gave a tiny shake of my head. Not now. She sat down at her desk, her eyes wide. The first 2 hours seemed to go Gerald's way. I watched him give the inspectors a tour of the facilities, showing them pristine records and perfect storage conditions. The main cold storage unit showed flawless temperature logs and fresh calibration records. I was sure he'd forged them after the equipment was fixed. But they looked legitimate. He presented licensing documentation for all our pharmacy clients. Somehow, he'd manufactured paperwork that appeared to verify the questionable pharmacies. He had answers for everything, delivered with corporate polish and apparent transparency. I started to despair. Maybe he'd covered his tracks too well. Maybe my sacrifice would achieve nothing. At 8:10, my computer calendar reminded me I had a meeting in 5 minutes. The meeting where Gerald planned to fire me. I stood up and walked to his office. He was still with the inspectors, but Sandra from HR was waiting in conference room B as scheduled. She looked uncomfortable when I entered. "I'm not sure if this meeting is still happening," she said, with the inspection. "Gerald specifically confirmed it this morning," I replied. "I'll wait." At 8:17, Gerald excused himself from the inspectors and came to the conference room. His jaw was tight. He sat down and Sandra placed a folder in front of me. "Aubrey," Gerald began, his voice cold, "we've discovered you've been consulting for another firm after hours. This is a direct violation of your employment agreement. Pack your desk." He pushed a severance agreement across the table. It offered 2 weeks' pay in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement and non-disparagement clause. I didn't touch it. Instead, I looked him directly in the eye and said, "That firm was the State Regulatory Board." The color drained from his face. Sandra looked confused. I continued, my voice steady. "At 7:30 this morning, they arrived for the surprise inspection you'd been warned about. By the way, whoever warned you? They're documenting every conversation. Obstruction of a federal investigation is a felony, Gerald. I was bluffing about someone documenting his warning, but his reaction told me I'd hit the mark. He'd been tipped off. And now, he was panicking about who might have evidence of it." Sandra looked between us, completely lost. "I don't understand." "Miss Walsh," I said, still looking at Gerald, "I've been cooperating with state and federal investigators regarding systematic violations of pharmaceutical distribution regulations. You might want to consult with legal before proceeding with this termination." Gerald stood up abruptly. "You've just admitted to corporate espionage, accessing confidential company information to provide to outside parties. That's evidence of criminal activity," I interrupted. "There's no confidentiality privilege for evidence of crimes, Gerald. You should know that." He left the room without another word. Sandra sat frozen, staring at the unsigned severance agreement. I went back to my desk. My hands were shaking, but I felt strangely calm. Whatever happened next, I'd said my piece. At 9:45, things started to unravel for Gerald. One of the DEA agents asked to see the backup cold storage unit, a secondary facility I'd mentioned in my reports. Gerald claimed it had been decommissioned months ago. The agent insisted on seeing it anyway. I watched from my desk as they walked to the warehouse. 15 minutes later, I saw Gerald's face as they returned. He looked like he'd been punched. The backup unit was running, full of medication, with no documentation, no temperature logs, no tracking at all. Hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of pharmaceuticals, stored with zero compliance oversight. That's where the compromised medications had been kept, the ones he couldn't explain through normal channels. The discovery of the undocumented storage unit changed everything. I watched Patricia and the DEA agents huddle in conversation, saw them make phone calls, observed Gerald trying to maintain his composure while clearly spiraling. Trevor was brought into a conference room with Patricia. The door closed. 30 minutes passed. 45. An hour. When the door finally opened, Trevor looked like he'd been crying. But there was also something else in his expression. Relief. Patricia called for a break and stepped outside to make a phone call. I saw her glance at me through the window, the tiniest nod of acknowledgement. The inspection continued through lunch. No one left. Sandwiches were ordered. The entire office was on edge. Work forgotten. Everyone watching the drama unfold. At 1:30, Richard Pemberton arrived. Our CEO had been out of town at a conference, but had caught the first flight back when the board contacted him. He looked furious and confused as Patricia met him at the door. They spoke privately for 20 minutes. When Richard emerged, his face was ashen. At 2:15, everything came to a head. One of the DEA agents emerged from Gerald's office carrying a computer tower. Behind him, another agent had boxes of files. Patricia approached Gerald, who was standing in the hallway trying to look unbothered. She asked him to step into the conference room. Diana was summoned too. Richard stood in the doorway, his face unreadable. I couldn't hear what was being said, but I could see through the glass walls. Patricia showed them something on a laptop. Gerald's corporate composure finally cracked. He started talking fast, gesturing, clearly trying to explain something. Then Patricia turned the laptop toward Diana. Whatever was on that screen made Diana slump in her chair like she'd been deflated. Richard's face went from pale to red. He stood up, said something sharp, and walked out. He went directly to his office and closed the door. 30 minutes later, 2 police officers arrived. Not campus security, actual police. At 4:30 on Monday afternoon, Gerald Patterson and Diana Huang were let out of MedSource distribution in handcuffs. The entire office watched in stunned silence as they were placed in separate patrol cars. Gerald kept his head down. Diana was crying. I sat at my desk, watching the people I'd worked with for years being arrested, and felt a complicated mix of vindication, sadness, and exhaustion. Patricia approached my desk. Aubrey, we're going to need a formal statement. Can you come to the board office tomorrow morning? I nodded. What happens now? Now we build the case, she said quietly. This is far from over. But you did the right thing. After she left, Melissa came to my desk. Was that about? Yes, I said simply. She hugged me. I'm so sorry you had to carry this alone. Trevor approached hesitantly. Aubrey, I need to talk to you. We went to the parking lot. Standing by my car, Trevor finally told me the truth. Gerald had been forcing him to falsify temperature logs, ship to unlicensed pharmacies, and accept cash payments from pharmacy representatives that never went through official accounting. He threatened Trevor's job, his family, everything. Trevor had been terrified. He pulled out his phone and showed me text messages from Gerald. Explicit threats, instructions to forge documents, evidence that would prove Gerald's intent. I was the one who sent you that email, Trevor admitted. The manifest photo. I didn't know what else to do. I was too scared to come forward, but I hoped if you saw it, you'd know what to do. I looked at this man who I'd worked with for years, who I'd half suspected of being part of the problem, and saw someone who'd been trapped just like me. Just like Diana, except he'd found a way to help without destroying himself. You did help, I told him. That photograph was part of the evidence package. You made a difference. He started crying. Not dramatic sobs, just quiet tears of relief. I have a daughter, he said. She's 3. I kept thinking about what kind of father I'd be if I helped poison people's medications. But I also thought about how I'd feed her if I lost my job. I understood that choice. I'd faced a version of it myself. Richard called an emergency all-staff meeting at 5. Everyone crowded into the large conference room. Richard looked like he'd aged 10 years in 8 hours. Many of you are aware that we had a regulatory inspection today, he began. What you may not know is that this inspection uncovered serious violations of pharmaceutical distribution law. Our COO and VP of operations have been arrested. Federal charges are pending. Gasps and murmurs filled the room. I want to be clear, Richard continued, his voice heavy. I had no knowledge of these activities, but that's no excuse. As CEO, the company's compliance is ultimately my responsibility. I should have paid closer attention. I should have listened when concerns were raised. His eyes found mine across the room. An employee tried to warn me. I didn't take it seriously enough. That failure is on me. After the meeting, Richard asked me to his office. I sat across from him, the same desk where I'd been dismissed when I first raised concerns. Aubrey, he said, I owe you an apology. A profound apology. You tried to tell me there were problems, and I chose to trust Gerald's corporate credentials over your expertise and integrity. People could have been seriously harmed because of my poor judgment. I didn't know what to say. I appreciated the apology, but it didn't change what had happened. I'd like to offer you Diana's position, he continued. VP of Operations, substantial salary increase. You've proven you have the integrity and judgment we need in leadership. I was genuinely surprised, and I surprised myself with my answer. I appreciate that, Richard, I really do. But I need to decline. I understood that choice. I'd faced a version of it myself. Because I don't want to work somewhere I had to risk everything to be heard, I said honestly. You're a good person, and I believe you didn't know what Gerald was doing. But I learned something through this process. I learned that institutional loyalty is a trap. I need to work somewhere. My first loyalty can be to doing what's right, not to protecting the company. He nodded slowly. I understand. What will you do? I don't know yet, I admitted, but I'll figure it out. I'd like to offer you Diana's position, he continued. VP of Operations, substantial salary increase. You've proven you have the integrity and judgment we need in leadership. The undocumented cold storage unit had been the breakthrough. It contained medications that should have been quarantined and destroyed, but were instead being repackaged and sold. Temperature logs showed the unit had been malfunctioning for over a year, long before I discovered the first discrepancy. Gerald's computer revealed everything. He'd created a parallel inventory system, separate from our official records. The legitimate system showed normal pharmacy orders. The hidden system tracked massive controlled substance shipments to the pill mill pharmacies. Gerald's computer revealed everything. He'd created a parallel inventory system, separate from our official records. The legitimate system showed normal pharmacy orders. The hidden system tracked massive controlled substance shipments to the pill mill pharmacies. What devastated me was learning about Diana's involvement. I'd wanted to believe she was just intimidated, forced to go along, but the evidence showed otherwise. Email chains revealed Diana had known about the unlicensed pharmacies from the beginning. She'd helped Gerald create false documentation. She'd received payments too, smaller than Gerald's but still substantial, deposited into an account she'd opened specifically for this purpose. Email chains revealed Diana had known about the unlicensed pharmacies from the beginning. She'd helped Gerald create false documentation. She'd received payments too, smaller than Gerald's but still substantial, deposited into an account she'd opened specifically for this purpose. That betrayal hurt worse than anything Gerald had done. I'd never trusted him, but I'd believed in Diana. Trevor's cooperation was crucial to the investigation. His text messages from Gerald provided clear evidence of criminal intent. His testimony about being threatened and forced to participate established the pattern of conduct. In exchange for his full cooperation, prosecutors granted him immunity from charges. The DEA traced medications from the pill mill pharmacies back to street distribution networks. 3 people had suffered serious adverse effects from improperly stored insulin that had lost potency. One was an elderly woman named Margaret Caldwell, who'd been hospitalized with diabetic complications when her insulin stopped working effectively. Dozens more had received medications that were less effective than they should have been. The human cost was real, documented, heartbreaking. That betrayal hurt worse than anything Gerald had done. I'd never trusted him, but I'd believed in Diana. Patricia shared that Margaret Caldwell had written a letter thanking me. The woman was 78, a retired teacher. She'd been confused and frightened when her blood sugar levels became unstable despite following her treatment regimen exactly. When the investigation revealed her insulin had been compromised during storage, her doctor was able to adjust her treatment and prevent long-term complications. I kept that letter on my refrigerator. On hard days when I doubted whether the cost had been worth it, I read it. The legal process moved forward. Gerald was charged with federal drug trafficking, conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. He initially tried to fight the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. His attorney eventually negotiated a plea deal. Gerald received 12 years in federal prison. Diana accepted a plea agreement earlier in the process. She cooperated with prosecutors, providing testimony about Gerald's operation. She received 7 years. MedSource faced federal fines totaling $7 million. The company also had to implement comprehensive compliance reforms, including hiring an independent monitor for 5 years. Richard worked with regulators to restructure the entire compliance program. He hired external consultants. He created new reporting channels for employees to raise concerns anonymously. He established policies requiring multiple people to approve any deviation from standard procedures. To his credit, Richard took responsibility publicly. He gave interviews acknowledging his failure to recognize the warning signs. He committed to making MedSource a model for pharmaceutical distribution compliance. But I still didn't want to work there. I'd been placed on paid administrative leave during the investigation, standard procedure when an employee is a key witness. I used the time to figure out what came next. My brother Nathan flew out to stay with me for 2 weeks. Having him there helped more than I could express. He didn't ask a lot of questions, didn't push me to talk about things I wasn't ready to discuss. He just made dinner, watched movies with me, and reminded me I wasn't alone. The hardest part was the isolation. Some former colleagues reached out to support me. Melissa called regularly. Trevor sent a long email thanking me and apologizing for not being braver. But others blamed me for the company's troubles. I saw posts on social media from former coworkers criticizing me for not handling it internally, for costing people their jobs when MedSource had to lay off staff to pay the fines. I had to remind myself that I wasn't responsible for Gerald's crimes or their consequences. I'd exposed wrongdoing. The damage to the company was caused by the people who committed those crimes, not by the person who reported them. Patricia became an unexpected source of support. We met for coffee every few weeks. She told me about her own experience as a whistleblower early in her career, how isolating it had been, how long it took to rebuild her professional life. The thing they don't tell you, she said during one conversation, is that doing the right thing doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it just feels necessary. That resonated with me. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt tired and sad and uncertain about the future. 3 months after the inspection, Patricia called with an offer. The State Pharmaceutical Regulatory Board was hiring a senior compliance investigator. The job involved working with companies to prevent violations, conducting inspections, and training new investigators. It was a pay cut from what Richard had offered me, but it was exactly what I wanted. I'd be on the right side of these issues from the start, able to prevent problems rather than having to expose them from inside broken systems. I accepted immediately. 6 months after that Monday morning inspection, I started my new job with the State Pharmaceutical Regulatory Board. My official title was Senior Compliance Investigator, but really, I was learning how to help companies do the right thing before problems escalated. The work was different from what I'd done at MedSource. Instead of being embedded in one company, I worked with dozens. I conducted inspections, but more often, I provided training and guidance. I helped smaller distribution companies set up proper compliance programs. I taught warehouse managers how to maintain temperature logs correctly. I reviewed policies and procedures, offering suggestions for improvement. I'd trained 3 new investigators by the end of my first year. I'd conducted 14 inspections, finding violations in only 2 cases, both minor issues that were corrected immediately. I'd helped 2 companies completely overhaul their compliance programs, preventing serious problems before they occurred. The best part was knowing I was making a difference before people got hurt. I also became an informal mentor to potential whistleblowers who contacted the board with concerns. Patricia would sometimes ask me to speak with employees who were wrestling with whether to report violations. I could tell them honestly what the process was like, what protections existed, and what limitations they had, and what it felt like to put your career on the line for principal. Some decided to report. Others chose different paths. I didn't judge either choice. I just tried to help them make informed decisions. One afternoon, I was grabbing coffee before a training session I was leading when I saw Trevor in line ahead of me. He looked good, healthier than he had at MedSource, less stressed. We sat down together, and he told me about his new job at a smaller pharmaceutical distributor. The company had rigorous ethical standards and a culture that encouraged speaking up about concerns. He was thriving there. He also told me he'd started volunteering with a nonprofit organization that helped combat opioid addiction in Colorado. Working with people whose lives had been damaged by the illegal drug trade, hearing their stories, had given him a different perspective on what we'd uncovered at MedSource. I think about those pharmacies we were supplying, he said. The pills that ended up on the street, destroying lives. I was part of that chain. Even though I was forced, even though I was scared, I was still part of it. You helped stop it, I reminded him. That text message you sent me, your testimony, that mattered. I know, he said. But I also know I should have been braver sooner. I'm trying to make up for that now. I understood that impulse. I was trying to do the same thing in my own way. Running into Trevor reminded me that we were all human, all imperfect, all capable of both courage and cowardice depending on the circumstances. What mattered was recognizing when we'd fallen short and choosing to do better. The legal cases against Gerald and Diana concluded about 8 months after their arrests. Both plea agreements were finalized. They were sentenced and sent to federal prison. I didn't attend the sentencing hearings. I didn't need to see them again. Richard reached out to me occasionally, updating me on MedSource's reforms. The company had survived, though it was smaller now. They'd lost some contracts. Several employees had left. But they were building something better, Richard insisted. A culture where speaking up was rewarded instead of punished. I hoped that was true. Time would tell. I'd been invited to speak at a pharmaceutical industry conference about compliance, culture, and ethical leadership. Standing backstage before my presentation, I thought about how different my life was from that Thursday morning when I'd stood in Gerald's office. I'd lost a job I loved. I'd lost colleagues I'd considered friends. I'd lost my naive belief that institutions would protect whistleblowers and that doing the right thing would be rewarded. But I'd gained something more valuable. The absolute knowledge that when it mattered most, when the pressure was highest and the cost was steepest, I'd chosen people over profit, truth over comfort, and justice over job security. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. Heard you're speaking at the conference. Proud of you. You've changed more lives than you know. I smiled, saved my presentation notes, and walked toward the stage. The presentation went well. I talked about the importance of creating systems where employees felt safe raising concerns. I discussed the warning signs of compliance breakdown. I emphasized that ethical leadership meant listening to frontline staff, who often saw problems first. During the question period, a young woman in the audience stood up. She introduced herself as a quality assurance specialist at a regional distributor. She asked, "What do you do when you see something wrong but you're afraid reporting it will cost you everything?" The room went quiet, waiting for my answer. "I won't lie to you," I said. "It might cost you everything. Whistleblower protections exist, but they're imperfect. You could lose your job, damage your career, face retaliation that's subtle enough to be legal." I paused, making eye contact with her. But here's what I learned. The cost of staying silent is paid by people who have no idea they're at risk. By patients who trust their medications are safe. By communities dealing with addiction crises. By families who lose loved ones to preventable harm. I had to ask myself what kind of person I wanted to be. Someone who protected herself, or someone who protected others. Once I framed it that way, the choice became clear. It wasn't easy. It wasn't safe. But it was right. And at the end of the day, I can look in the mirror and know that when it mattered most, I chose integrity. That's worth more than any job security. The young woman nodded slowly. I didn't know if she'd report whatever she'd seen. That was her choice to make. But I hoped I'd given her something to think about. After the conference, I drove home thinking about everything I'd been through. The fear, the isolation, the betrayal, the vindication. All of it had led me here, to a career where I could help prevent the kind of crisis I'd uncovered. I thought about Margaret Caldwell's letter, still on my refrigerator, about Trevor finding redemption through service, about Richard rebuilding MedSource with better values, about the 3 investigators I'd trained who would carry forward the mission of protecting public health. The system wasn't perfect. People still cut corners, still prioritized profit over safety, still retaliated against those who spoke up. But the system was also full of people like Patricia, like Trevor, like that young woman at the conference, all trying to do better. My phone rang. It was Patricia. "How'd the presentation go?" "Good," I said. "Really good, actually." "Listen, I'm calling because we have a situation developing at a distributor in Wyoming. Possible temperature control issues. Could use someone with your specific expertise to consult on the investigation." I smiled. "Send me the details. I'm on it." As I hung up, I realized something. I was happy. Despite everything I'd lost, despite the hard road I'd traveled, I was doing work that mattered with people I respected, making a real difference in protecting public health. That Thursday morning when Gerald tried to fire me, I'd been terrified about losing my career. What I didn't understand then was that I wasn't losing my career. I was finding my calling. The work continues. There will always be people who prioritize profit over safety, who think they can cut corners without consequences, who believe they're too smart to get caught. And there will always need to be people willing to stand up to them, to document the truth, to protect those who can't protect themselves. I learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's knowing you might lose everything and choosing integrity anyway. I learned that institutions don't protect whistleblowers as much as they claim, but that documentation, the right allies, and moral conviction can level the playing field. Most importantly, I learned that you can't control whether people call you a hero or a traitor for speaking up. What you can control is whether you choose people over profit when it matters most. And when you make that choice, when you sacrifice comfort for conscience, you gain something that no one can take away from you. The knowledge that you did the right thing, even when it cost you everything. That's worth more than any job, any salary, any career advancement. That's integrity. And integrity, I've discovered, is its own reward. So here's my question for you. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between what was easy and what was right? What did you do? How did it turn out? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Your experiences might help someone else facing a similar choice. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about the courage it takes to stand up for what's right, please hit that like button. Subscribe to hear more stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary ethical dilemmas, and share this with someone who might need to hear that doing the right thing, even when it's hard, is always worth it. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reminded you that one person with courage and conviction really can make a difference. Stay true to yourselves, trust your moral compass, and never be afraid to speak up when something is wrong. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.